Life in Rukongai is difficult for a child. Surrounded by thieves and murderers in the slums, the only route for Rukia and Renji to leave was through Soul Society, finding a place with those snobbish aristocrats through their merit with spiritual power. Together, they were a family, and they would survive. But within that world, Rukia received an offer to be adopted into that nobility. Rukia and Renji were separated, taken from each other. But this wasn't some tragedy, something unavoidable. Rukia moved away while Renji stayed in place. These respective motions are the opposite of one another, yet what's driving them is the same. Rukia had been the first to suggest that they become Soul Reapers, the first to push for the pair to move on from their circumstances, those that had taken the rest of their family away from them. With that in mind, when the opportunity came for Rukia to be put in an even better position, Renji pushed her forward, thinking of her. Yet that forced smile was met with a glance of disappointment. Rukia's family was not the Kuchiki clan, but with Renji, yet he so easily pushed her away, and Rukia, one who was quick to move away from others, did so, leaving Renji doubtful. Renji was strong, but Byakuya was far stronger. He could much more easily protect his family. Renji didn't need to get in the way of that, so he told himself. And yet, meeting her again, Renji bore not doubt, but resentment at that human expression she wore. The expression that betrayed her position in the Kuchiki family, that betrayed her position as a Soul Reaper. The expression that betrayed everything she'd given up to be there. Those humans who Rukia came to value had not only doomed her by receiving her spirit energy, but in turn made meaningless all the bonds she'd given up on to take a position alongside them. And yet, the motion was commonplace to Rukia. Where Renji was stuck in place for fear to open up, Rukia kept away from that district that took so many of their first family members away from her, away from the last of them to survive who'd kept her at arm's length, and away from her newest friends who helped her find a human expression to wear. As Soul Society pulled her away, she told Ichigo she would never forgive him if he followed her, even as her face said everything she'd avoided saying in her words. Soul Society was home to a system that enforced stagnancy, that kept things as they were. Though Rukia and Renji had sought that stability, once they had become a part of it, it enforced a retention of their flaws, of their fears. The heart is an intangible bond between two, Rukia and Renji being two who kept their hearts closed for their fears. One too afraid to move to retain that heart, and one too afraid to stay for it. Thinking of others over themselves, their hearts remain closed. And yet, like on some level, Rukia wanted Renji to hold her back, to keep her in place. Renji wanted to move after her. By telling Rukia about the incursion of her friends, giving her a bit of hope, he came to learn that though she left them much like she once left him, she still had lingering feelings. Though she sacrificed herself to protect them, though they endangered themselves for her sake, she had the faintest hope that they might come to her aid. Through witnessing that lingering bond, Renji came to understand that though she tended to keep her distance, that wasn't what she really wanted. Having put Rukia first and foremost, the question of what she truly wanted was followed with one of what he really wanted, and the duty that the two of them were obligated to follow. As a Soul Reaper, it was Renji's duty to ensure Rukia was executed, and her duty to die. Yet when he went to clash with Ichigo and fight the one trying to interrupt that duty, he'd made a concession, leaving behind his badge. In his battle, Renji placed himself, the one staying still, against one who moved so much like he'd once wanted to, and that motion was one he could not stand against. In his defeat, with his badge gone, he was no longer Renji the assistant captain, but Renji the stray dog, barking at the moon but too fearful to pierce it. In his failure, in his fear to go against Byakuya, he may not have succeeded, but Ichigo could find victory in his place. Fighting for his duty, in death he tried to take some solace in the possibility that Rukia might be saved, even if it wasn't by him. But he didn't die. Left alive, Renji was once again in a position where he could either stay still, following his duty to do nothing, or move. And thanks to Ichigo, his world had changed. He'd seen someone with the courage to move into action, and so Renji followed in those footsteps, striking at the source of his fears, the insurmountable evocation of the system that entrapped Rukia. Though that wall was still unsurmountable, Renji fighting for a bond he'd yet to reforge, after facing Byakuya's Bankai and the fear of such a powerful foe, he still had the courage to move, his fangs reaching the moon. To walk is not to succeed, it's to have a chance. Achieving Bankai, he'd made progress, but the one he faced was still one resolute. and one much the opposite of Renji, in the same way Rukia was. Though Byakuya had risked his position for Rukia, the sister of his deceased wife, he did not form a connection with her, keeping her at arm's length. Renji had expected him to be family to Rukia, but in his desire to not subvert his duty ever again, he was anything but. The two were all too similar, keeping their distance, moving away, in that fear of the pain that came from forming bonds. At the start of the story, Rukia very much presented herself as the ideal Soul Reaper, echoing her own brother. With Ichigo challenging her authority, she threatened to kill him for insolence. When discussing mod souls, Soul Reapers toying with lives they themselves created, Rukia felt it wasn't her place to question it, claiming it was outside of her control. Through refusing to challenge authority, she didn't have to concern herself with connections or feelings. It was safe, cautious, and easy to keep her distance. She knew all too well what would happen if she didn't. After becoming a Soul Reaper proper, her first real connection was with Kaien, her superior. But although that was the case, compared to how she was treated by everyone else, his casual nature was like a blast of cold air. As a noble, other Soul Reapers tread lightly around her. Byakuya exuded a dry indifference. When Rukia told him that she didn't rank as a seat in the 13th company, he told her to leave, implying his distance from her was due to her lack of results or ability that would allow him to recognize her, rather than the fear of pain and getting close that Rukia too would be driven by. But Kaien didn't care about her nobility. She was a subordinate, him the vice captain. Where Rukia had been afraid to get close, Kaien broke her barriers as casually as he did with anyone in his unit. But where he'd so easily connected with her, she couldn't reciprocate. Kaien fought and died for his pride, for his vengeance. Though he valued the connections he described as heart, he fought without them. And falling under possession of a hollow, it was Rukia who struck him down. Rukia was left with Kaien's heart, yet in her fear, the pain she'd experienced through having that connection to him while committing the act she ran. She'd blamed herself for the outcome, as it was for her own feelings, her own fears, not Kaien's pride or memory, that she'd killed him. Kaien would never want for her to abandon her friends and cut off those bonds, yet for her own feelings she did. Kaien gave her his heart, and she did not accept it. So too did she hurt Ichigo by giving him power, slating him for death by the Soul Reapers in the world she brought him to. And so too did she run from the heart that had formed. But that was just her perspective, as Ichigo was saved by those powers, regretting that Rukia was being hurt because he'd been too weak to in turn save her. Moving forward to keep things as they were, Ichigo readily accepted the difficulty in saving Rukia because she'd given him much more than she could imagine. Rukia had killed Kaien and saved Ichigo, taking the blame of everything onto herself, not recognizing that in keeping her distance, in bearing the burden of her mistakes, in running from that pain she wasn't strong enough to handle on her own, she was only causing more. So consumed by her self-pity, she couldn't imagine that those around her weren't hurting as badly as she was.
ごちゃごちゃ悩みすぎなんだよ、てめえは。昔からな。誰もてめえが思うほど、てめえを悪く思っちゃいねえよ。自分ばっか責めてんじゃねえ。何でもかんでも背負って立てるほど、てめえは頑丈じゃねえだろうが。分けろ。俺の肩にも、イチゴの肩にも。ちょっとずつ乗っけて、ちょっとずつ立ちゃいい。そのために俺たちは強くなったんだ。
Renji couldn't move because he was weak. Rukia couldn't stay close to others because she was weak. But like Renji found his strength, so could Rukia. Ichigo reforged the bond Rukia had sought to cut off, and after Orihime distanced herself for her own reasons, Rukia joined Ichigo, Renji, and her friends in trying to save her, when she was faced with the ghost of her past. A piece of her heart she had shamefully cut away. Eroniro took Kaien's face and his memory, but he did not respect it. In her guilt, Rukia was prepared to die, but she would not take her friends with her. Eroniro shamed Kaien's memory by demanding she throw away what he stood for by demanding Rukia betray his friends, and in doing so, showed Rukia the value of her prior actions. Although she'd done it for her own feelings, by killing Kaien she preserved his memory, preserved his heart. Kukaku once did so by helping Ichigo even though he was a Soul Reaper, the same as Rukia, who took Kaien away from them. To respect his memory and the bond she had with him, she preserved that heart, where Ganjo had let his hate of Soul Reapers get in the way, failing to respect his bond with Cayenne and evoking the same failure as Rukia, the one he hated. But faced with their failings, Rukia came to remember Cayenne's words. Remember that even though he was gone, he was still with her. The imposter in front of her may have had his face, his techniques, his memories, his zanpakuto, but he was not Cayenne. There was no heart to be found, so Rukia could freely cut him off. Running away might increase the distance, but even if she were gone, her heart would remain in those she'd befriended, and if getting closer could save them, then she would move with all that she had. To cross that line and conquer that fear is strength. For Rukia, against the embodiment of fear in Naught, one who only feared his own death, who only feared the one who gave him life, had no power against one with courage. The epitome of Sode no Shiroyuki's capabilities was Haka no Togame, Rukia's Bankai, one that pushed her to walk that fine line of courage and fear. Manipulating her body temperature required careful movements, a level of stillness in the face of death that one gripped by fear could not run from without shattering. For one who had once so easily sacrificed herself and moved away from others for her fears, Byakuya's words rung true. Nothing can be protected by a sword swung in exchange for one's life. Though Rukia neared death, she would not reach it, or offer herself to it. That was her courage. The courage that finally earned her Byakuya's recognition, finally formed a heart between those family members who once kept their distance. Renji Zabimaru too possessed a Bankai of distance, Hihio Zabimaru extending his reach. Bankai cannot be so easily repaired. In losing segments, Renji's reach gradually shrunk over the course of the series. Like Rukia and Byakuya were flawed for the distance they kept, Renji's Bankai was achieved while he'd been trying to reach Rukia, but in only being half recognized by Zabimaru, it was only partway complete. He and Ichigo both achieved half-complete Bankai out of their half-baked desire to defeat Byakuya. It was only after continuing to fight and better understand themselves that they came to their true capabilities. Renji's Zabimaru was a sword spirit twofold, a monkey and a snake. In Soul Society, the monkey, calm, came to recognize Renji, where the snake did not. Ichibe stating that his Bankai had been incomplete because of that half-recognition. Echoing his own self-hatred for his failures to preserve the heart he so valued, the snake's words were filled with venom, constantly bitter at Renji for his every failure. Hihio Zabimaru was a monkey using a snake to reach out, too afraid to touch anything itself. For that fear of getting closer, Renji remained limited. However, upon being given that route for self-introspection, upon recognizing his faults, he accepted himself as a villain, no longer having any pretensions about following his supposed duty or doing the right thing, no longer burdened by the mistakes he'd made in the past now that he could move forward, only focusing on what he wants. With nothing to fear, he finally reached out. The left arm that had been pushed away by Rukia, that had been capable of protecting her, was now front and center of his Bankai, Soul Zabimaru no longer defined by its reach, Renji having to move closer of his own volition to make it effective. From Ichigo, Rukia found it in herself to remain by her friends. From Ichigo, Renji had learned to move forward, and for that, he would always be there to drag him forward. It was because of Ichigo that Rukia and Renji could finally reconnect after their fears tore them apart, that connection leading to the product of their bonds, their happiness, their courage. Ichika's name being a bit reminiscent of that friend who pulled them together. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons. Thanks Nitrorad, Dojo32161, Mr. Cynical, Flarbu, Maz, Gloogle, Sam Bellmeyer, Brorike, Offline But Not, Bayanort, Tengoon, and Mohammed Akeem. Thank you for watching.